So welcome everyone to our lecture with Daniel Tubb on his book, Shifting Livelihoods, Gold Mining and Subsistence in the Chocó, Colombia. So my name is Tracy Glenn and I'm the professor for the environmental praxis class at St. Thomas University, which is hosting today's lecture. So this lecture is being organized in partnership with the MB Media Co-op and Raven, which is a research project on media and activism for rural environmental and social justice based at the University of New Brunswick that our speaker is also part of. So I want to begin by acknowledging that this event is being organized on the unceded territories of the Wolastoqey, and I hope that the lectures in the series in different ways get us to reflect on the spirit of the peace and friendship treaties that were signed between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, and Sakat peoples in the 1700s, and reflect on our responsibilities as treaty people. So today we are joined by Daniel Tubb, who's an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, and trained at Carleton University in the late 2000s as an anthropologist. He's written a book and academic articles on Colombia, on writing, on small scale and artisanal mining, on violence and citizenship. He specializes in sociocultural and environmental anthropology, ethnography, and on political economy on Colombia and New Brunswick. Like I said earlier, he's a collaborator with the research project Raven and serves on the editorial board of the MB Media Co-op. So his most recent book, Shifting Livelihoods, published by the University of Washington Press, is about gold mining in Colombia and how people employ various methods to extract gold in the rainforests of the Chocó in northwest Colombia. So I will now turn it over to Daniel, who's going to speak for a bit about the book. And I have a couple questions for him, and then we'll also open it up to all of you to ask Daniel some questions.
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, everyone. I can't see any of you. Your cameras are all off, but that's fine. Nice to meet you virtually. My name is Daniel Tubb. I'm very excited to talk about my book that Tracy held up, and I'm going to hold up as well. My plan for today is, rather than me give you a 45-minute lecture, which I don't have prepared and are hard to absorb over Zoom, my goal is to give you a little bit of an insight in the book, the writing process, what it's about. I hope you've all had a chance to read the preface that is available online and that Tracy shared with you. And I really want to have a conversation about Tracy. I'm an expert, supposedly, on gold mining. Tracy is an expert on gender and mining in Indonesia. So I'm not sure what she's going to ask, but I hope we can talk about it. I'm kind of excited. So Tracy, thank you for the introduction. I really need to sort of put together a shorter autobiography because that's always slightly embarrassing because it's so long. But anyway, it's really an honor to be here. To be part of the St. Thomas Environmental Praxis lecture series, to speaking with everyone here. And I'm really excited about my first book. Books take a long time to come. In this book, it emerges out of 18 months of fieldwork that I did in Colombia, learning how to mine gold using hand tools and techniques in the Colombian Pacific Department of the Chocó, between 2010 and 2012, right? So the book came out in 2020. That's 8 years. It was a long time coming. I'm proud of it, and I'm excited to tell you about it. So when I was in Colombia, I was doing my doctoral fieldwork for a PhD in anthropology. And the book that emerges out of that fieldwork, out of the dissertation, out of articles I published afterwards, out of a 4-year process of writing, I'm persistent if I'm not efficient, is about living alongside a gold rush. As an anthropologist, I spent my time doing ethnography, doing participant observation, spending a lot of time working with working alongside artisanal and small-scale gold miners living in an Afro-Colombian community in northwest Colombia. So what does the book try and do? The book describes the lives and livelihoods of people who employ various methods to extract gold in the rainforests of the Chocó. On the one hand, rural Afro-Colombian artisanal miners work hillsides with hand tools or dredge mud from river bottoms. On the other hand, migrant miners from other regions of Colombia level the landscape with excavators, and they trap gold with the toxic heavy metal, mercury. And at the same time, Canadian mining companies prospect for open pit mega mines, and yet never seem to build anything. At the same time, drug traffickers launder cocaine profits by smuggling gold into Colombia and claiming it came from fictitious small-scale gold mines. So through an ethnography of gold, right, following the metal, I examine the movement of people, commodities, and capital, and I show how resource extraction, right, how artisanal, small-scale, and multinational gold industries reshape the place. The argument is that gold enables forms of a shifting livelihood, of rebusque. So shifting livelihoods, which is the title, is also the central theoretical or central contribution of the book. It's my translation of the Colombian word rebusque. Rebusque is a word that describes the livelihood strategies of forest dwellers and migrant gold miners alike as they seek informal work amidst a gold rush. So in the book, I hope, mining's effects on rural people, on corporations, and on politics are on view in what I hope is a readable account of daily life in a region where the economy is shaped by gold and cocaine. What I hadn't planned when I wrote the book was how much work it would take to make a book that is, I hope, at once readable, perhaps sometimes even lyric and accessible, appropriate not only for academics and researchers, but also undergraduates and a more general public. I hope that one reading this book not only understands a lot more about gold mining and informal livelihoods and getting by in Colombia, but I hope that it's also a good read. I spent a lot of time crafting a book that is evocative, like a good ethnography is, evocative of life during a gold rush, replete with the complexity and contradiction that one finds during long-term ethnographic fieldwork. What began as 18 months learning how to mine gold was followed by 2 years writing a dissertation, 4 years writing a book about a gold rush. It seems to me that writing was a much longer and time-consuming process than the research itself. And I think in academia, this is actually often the case. But what I hope results is a readable account of a 21st century gold rush in Colombia. So in concrete, before we get to some questions, the book itself follows 6 or so mines over 6 chapters. The book is divided into 3 parts. So the first part dwells on people panning for gold, right? Using wooden pans that are about this size, and this artisanal, right? This hand production of gold using hand tools and techniques embedded in what I call a dual household economy, right? This dual household economy combines activities for household subsistence and cash generation, which facilitates, I argue, both a productive way of life and gives a mine its emancipatory potential. It is this kind of mining that allows subsistence producers like Martina and Pedro and Don Alfonso, who are the main characters or the central protagonists of the people I'm writing about in the first 2 chapters. It helps producers like Martina and Pedro and Don Alfonso stay on their land. Far from a commodity curse, artisanal mines support what for Martina, Pedro and Don Alfonso and others is a good life. So in part 1, production with wooden pans become a successful stratagem of some of the poorest and most marginalized communities in Colombia, a strategy that beats the alternatives. That's part 1. Part 2 moves to a different kind of mining. It moves to small-scale gold mining, people using excavators and heavy machinery, and it moves to a kind of accumulation. And here I focus on a mine owned by a Black family who decided to invite in outsiders in an attempt to get rich quick. From the perspective of landowning families like Esteban's and the hopes of small-scale miners like Jose and Geraldo and their workers, the second part considers the expansion of the small-scale mining frontier and the movement away from a dual household economy. People from rural and urban areas attempt to accumulate cash through illegal and informal mining. And small-scale mining becomes one of various schemes of rebusque, which were attractive to small-scale miners from urban shantytowns as well as families who owned rural land. Their rebusque, right, their shifting livelihood may not have been legal, but it was moral for most involved. Well, the goal for both miner and landowner was to accumulate cash by bringing in mechanized mining using dredges and excavators. And although the optimism was contagious, the land that Esteban gave to machines ultimately did not give any gold, right? Their hopes didn't pan out, excuse the pun. So that's part two. The last two chapters, part three, focus on the global connections of gold, right? And here the focus is on forms not of value production through artisanal mining, nor value accumulation through small-scale mining, but instead forms of value transformation, on the one hand through cocaine money laundering, and on the other through stock market speculation. So here, mines that produce little or no actual metal, right? There's no gold being produced from under the ground, are actually part of broader processes, be it money laundering or speculation of multinational corporations. So both of these processes show how the transformation of value, rather than the production of gold or the accumulation of cash, has become important. These are unexpected connections which show how broader economic processes reshape places as extensive networks of contemporary capital work through the ability to facilitate processes of value transformation. On the one hand, drug cash being laundered through fake gold mines, and on the other hand, investor cash being worked through corporate insiders as they pretend to be looking for gold mines in Colombia. What these three parts follow are the connections out from a rural way of life in the Colombian Pacific to places far beyond the Chocó, through the networks of the drug trade and speculative capitalism. And throughout it all, each chapter always returns to a place and the lived experience of men and women, like the people I write about, like Lady and her neighbors who find their shifting livelihoods through rebusque. Taken together, the stories tell of unexpected resilience, of muddling along and finding creative ways to confront a lack of opportunity through various forms of rebusque. Gold becomes one strategy among others, and it is at once an integral part of a place-based livelihood and a way of life that is both supported by and threatened by the arrival of outsider-owned small-scale mines and excavators and dredges. It offers a path towards a livelihood, a certain freedom for some, even the good life, as I argue in the first chapter, even as it is contingent, contradictory, and very precarious. So that's the book. I'm looking forward to Tracy's questions. I see she's taking lots of notes. But I want to conclude with some thoughts on ethnographic writing, and then she's going to get at me with whatever she wants to ask in a very non-confrontational way, I'm sure. So, ethnographers often begin with what writers have come to think of as a kind of vignette, right? Perhaps it's an entry into the field or an illustrative and evocative example of something more general, right? Rendered as best one can, always imperfectly into words. And later, after Tracy and I talk, I'm going to sort of do an example of this kind of vignette. Such vignettes sometimes stand alone, but more often they are used to set up an argument or a line of analysis. Often they can seem kind of merely illustrative narratives that are begun and then dropped, right? That serve as the argument, and that can sometimes seem a second place to the theory. So in Shifting Livelihoods, I've always tried to make such description, right, such ethnographic writing, not as a mere opening gambit, right, but rather the substantive mode of the book itself. The book is a book of what I've come to think of as ethnographic shorts. The analysis and arguments are always built out of the narrative thread, right? Out of things that happen, my best rendition of what actually happened. Of course, this is my rendition. It's a third-hand interpretation, sometimes of second-hand interpretations of other people's realities with all of the problems that entails. But each short in Shifting Livelihoods is a description and a narrative woven as tightly as possible with a more analytic mode. The mode I adopt is not one of description, serving as a mere isolated example, but it is the narrative that is woven throughout the analysis that pushes everything forward. The analysis and interpretation. In a way, this is the mode of expository, literary, creative nonfiction, a genre from which I've learned a lot. Each chapter draws out my best rendition, developed from field notes, from interviews, from memory, from 18 months of fieldwork. The shorts are as concise, engaging, and descriptive as possible, and yet they allow the narrative to move forward. So, with that that strategy, I hope I was able to write a book that offers both a compelling read and also an important interpretation of what's going on. To do this, I relied on my notebooks, on memory, on photographs, on interviews. I tried to stay with particular moments. In effect, the book is actually a very developed book about 4 or 5 days of fieldwork that I'm using as a jumping off point to do exposition. The book was a process of reading, of revision, of editing, of forgetting, of rewriting, of reordering, of reassembling, and remaking, which is probably why it took so long. But it's always grounded in that ethnography. I'm not a pioneer in the literary form, but I do hope that the book offers a really good sense of a gold rush. So with that, I'm going to take Tracy's questions. I hope you have a sense of the book now. I'm going to try and stumble through whatever answers that come to mind, and then I'm going to close with reading a few pages from the introduction with some photographs. So Tracy, you'll have to keep me and yourself on track because I don't know how long this is supposed to go, and you'll be controlling the PowerPoints.
Okay, I was going to ask, the PowerPoint's coming at the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
It'll come with the reading.
Oh, okay.
You went already in the notes.
Okay. We actually answered my first question a little bit just now, but maybe you could comment a little bit more.
Ask it anyway. I'll see if we can say something else.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about explaining about why you chose ethnography as a method of inquiry, if there's any shortcomings to that. As someone who also uses ethnography, I've read a bit, about like Sherry Ortner, who talks about the need for deeper ethnographies, who's critical of some of the ethnographic work that's out there. And so I was wondering too. You did talk a little bit about the different ethnographic methods, but maybe if you could share a little bit more about how long you were in the field and
Sure.
And why you're different.
Yeah, I can do that. So I'm looking at why ethnography, and then what are some of the weaknesses, and what do I think of Sherry Ortner? So what did I do? I was in the field in Colombia, doing the field work that became this book for 18 months. Much of that time, although not all of it, I was living on a river in a particular Afro-Colombian community of about 20 people, spending my time at one of 3 or 4 gold mines. If you're a sociologist, my end sample is very small. It's, I know a lot about a very small number of mines. At the same time, I was there for 18 months. I visited lots of other places. I talked to many people. But ethnography allows a really deep and practical, embodied even, in the sense that my method was mining, right? I was throwing stones. I would get up at 6 a.m, and I would go work with Pedro or Esteban or Jose and Geraldo at different mines. And so that opens up possibilities, right? It opens up relationships of friendship. of affect, right, of emotional bonds that are impossible to get at other ways. Now, you can come in and do different kinds of research. You might want to come in and do interviews or surveys. And certainly when I was in the field, people would do that. I remember moments when someone doing a sociological research project would show up. Often in the afternoon, they would have a survey, a series of questions. People would have been working all day at the mine. They'd be tired. They didn't particularly want to talk to anyone. And then they'd be answering these questions. So you get at things doing that. You can start to make truth claims that I can't, right? Ethnography is a bizarre, perhaps, mode of inquiry where you yourself, as the ethnographer, are the primary method of investigation. This doesn't mean you're only doing participant observation. You're reading everything you can. You're doing archival work. You're doing dozens of interviews. I took thousands of photographs. I recorded hours and hours of video. All of that is allowed for by the ethnography. Why did I do ethnography? Part of it is I'm an anthropologist, a sociocultural anthropologist, and ethnography is central to the discipline. What you do kind of as a rite of passage, you do ethnography. You go out and do what it is that people do for a long period of time, and that gives you the knowledge from which to make right ethnography, right truth claims. What are the weaknesses? In my own field work, one chapter is about gold mining. Sorry, one chapter is about money laundering. That was the result of doing a lot of reading after fieldwork, right? I had all these questions. I knew too much. I had all of this stuff. And then as I left the field, as I was back at Ottawa, as I was writing, I started to read newspapers. And it's these stories I started coming across of people smuggling gold into Colombia and passing it off in small-scale mines. I got inklings of this from fieldwork, right? But no one was telling me, hey, this is money laundering. And it was more stories of like, hey, there's this mine where all this gold is produced, or all this work is being done, but no gold is being produced. What's going on? And I'm, have questions. So ethnography itself is not enough. But then if you go back to notes and queries from the early 20th century, ethnography encompasses many things other than just participant observation. One of the sort of tricks I think that is important to think about with some of the work of Sherry Ortner, and she has this article on this idea of ethnographic refusal, where some things you don't write about from ethnographically, and so often some topics, internal dynamics of particular organizations, you may not end up writing about as a refusal to do ethnography. In my own book, there are things that I know about life in the Chocó that I don't write about the book. I never name places. I'm never geographically specific. In Colombia, there's conflict in rural areas, and so I'm writing about the Chocó at a river. I never define exactly which river or which community. People have pseudonyms. There's areas that I could have written chapters about, but a book, if you want it to be read, has to be a certain length, about 90,000 words. And so there's so much in this book that there's so much that isn't in this book, which one could say is an ethnographic refusal, or maybe things I'll start writing about in other moments. So, the short answer to your question, Tracy, why ethnography? I'm an anthropologist. We do ethnography. If you didn't do ethnography as a sociocultural anthropologist, I'd be asking, well, what did you do? So, yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could comment on what it's like, or what it was like being a white researcher from a university institution in Canada, the global north. How did it affect your research or results, and if and what advice you would give to researchers like yourself with a positionality like yourself doing?
Sure. Yeah. I think this is sort of this question of positionality. Has become central in anthropology for the last 30 years, and is this sort of ever-present existential crisis on what it is to do ethnography. Right? Can you only write about yourself? Right? How is it that I, as a straight, able-bodied, white, heterosexual, English-speaking man from the global north, can do ethnography in the Colombian Pacific. Some of it is, some of it I think of as sort of the happenstance of one's own autobiography. So when I grew up in a small town in rural Ontario, downriver from a former gold mine. Not quite downriver, but anyway, 20 minutes north from where I grew up in Eastern Ontario is the mine of Del Oro and El Dorado. These are Spanish names for mines or community in a mine. The mine of Del Oro, I think it is, and the community of El Dorado, I might have that reversed. These were the first Spanish words I learned in their late 90s. My mother was a journalist for a community paper, writing about all of the negative impacts of this coal mine, all the negative impacts of uranium refining that went on there, and all of these kinds of things. And so as a teenager and as a child, these were the first Spanish words I learned. And mining was always at the back of my mind. I'm giving you the wrong different answer. I'm giving you how I ended up in Colombia. But I think it helps understand then why sort of that positionality question. So I ended up going to university, wanted to learn French. Classes were full, so I took Spanish. I was terrible, like really, really, really bad. And so I decided I actually wanted to learn Spanish and did a year in Spain, had some Colombian friends. They told me how great Colombia was. I returned to Trent and was doing lots of Spanish novels for courses, and they were 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. They were The Virgin of the Assassins, which is about Medellin, by Fernando Vallejo. And I was like both intrigued and like, why would I ever want to go to this country? It sounds terrifying. My friend from Spain, who was Colombian, was telling me all these changes in Medellin. And so as I was looking for a master's project, I ended up proposing sort of, for no particular reason, hey, why don't I go to Medellin and learn about what's going on in the city? Why is the city with a reputation of the highest homicide rate in the world in the early 1990s become a city of progressive urban public policy, of building libraries in the poorest slums and all of these really cool things? So I ended up in Medellin because I happened to get a grant. Because in Canada, if you're lucky and you have good grades and you can come up with a good project, and you were lucky, mostly if you're lucky, which also, ends up being about, one's class background, one's educational background, one's gender, all of these kinds of things. I was 23, 24, got the grant, went to Medellin, realized things were really complicated, had all these questions of why I was in Medellin, writing about this stuff, and was reading in the archives. And in the archives, I came across stories of Canadian mining companies opening offices in Medellin in the 1950s. And I'm like, why is a Canadian mining company doing in Colombia, in Medellin? What's going on in the 1950s? And then as I was just sort of fishing around for a PhD topic, I realized this is 2009. There are all of these Canadian mining companies in Colombia, in Latin America, around the world, doing lots of nasty things. I'm sure Tracy's talked about her work in Indonesia around a former Canadian mine. An example by a Brazilian company. And so as I was looking for a PhD topic, I was becoming obsessed or really interested in Colombia, in the music, in the people. It's a wonderful country. And at the same time, really getting sort of horrified by the presence. At the time, there were 60 or so junior mining companies in Colombia. And so my initial pitch for a PhD proposal was, I'm going to go study a Canadian mining company in Colombia. And I'll follow the whole process, right? I'll look at what it's like to be a junior mining company, to build a mine, and all of the sort of ramifications, the negative ramifications. Let's be honest. The methodological challenge of that is you do a PhD, you only have a couple years of fieldwork, right? And I very quickly realized if I was to do that project and then the mine didn't get built in the 18 months or 2 years I was doing fieldwork, I would suddenly I wasn't sure what my project would be. And then I realized there's a lot of mining going on in Colombia. There's a vibrant in the sense of a lot of people doing it. gold mining industry, of artisanal and small-scale mining. Afro-Colombian Colombians in the Chocó have been mining gold for 400 years. They were brought over by the Spanish to do it. And then I started to realize, well, then if I don't, study the Canadian Mining Company, but I study gold miners, there's work. There's something there that's interesting. So how was it that I was able to go to Colombia as a white man, to the Chocó, which is predominantly Afro-Colombian, where 90% of the population is Black. Some of it was, I was lucky enough to have funding for 2 years, so I went slowly. I was trying to find a community where people wanted me to be there, and so that meant talking to a lot of people. It took me 6 months to figure out where to do the project, and I don't, when I'm in Colombia, I'm a tall white guy, and that shapes how people talk to you. It shapes the doors that are opened. It offers a certain modicum of protection. When I was going to the Chocó, I would, write emails and say, "Hey, I'm from Canada. I'm doing a PhD." As a student, you have a certain people often open up to you in certain ways. As a man, I was able to do field work that is much harder, I think, to do. Wouldn't have been possible to do as a woman. So gender plays into it. I think if one weakness in my book, one question that often comes up is, well, where's the gender? And it's often a very male perspective, in part because I was mostly hanging out with men. I'm working on a chapter for a presentation I'm giving in a few weeks on a gendered analysis of mining in the Chocó, going back to my field work and rethinking the impacts of mining on women and on men. So positionality is always there. I think it's always there in every interaction. And so then it goes back to the sort of existential angst. Can one write about something one is not? Or can you only write about what you know? Is autoethnography the only position? And there, I'm going to say that it's always fraught. There's always power. There's all of these questions. But when I read an ethnography, or when I read a journalist that is able to explain and share in a fair and respectful way other people's social lives, I think it is valuable. And so at base, I'm committed, or at base, I think if the work can pull it off, then I think that's important. So, but it doesn't ever get rid of the question of identity and who you are, or the questions of power. I mean, very bluntly, I had good funding, which gave me time. People who don't have the funding, it makes it much harder to do. And how did I get that funding? I was lucky. And I ended up having good mentors who edited my SHRC applications 20 times. Yeah. So I got lots of karma to pay back to my students. But Tracy, another question.
Okay, I was wondering about. I know from my time in Indonesia, and I worked more on large scale mining, but then and our organization would often get the big mining companies would respond to our criticisms by saying, well, look at what the artisanal miners are doing. They're dumping mercury into the river. And so I was wondering, about just the Chocó, like where the large scale mining company, like what the dynamics were between the large scale miners and the artisanal miners.
Sure. Okay. So here's a couple things to really disarticulate. The book is in 3 parts. Part 1 is artisanal mining. In Colombia, that refers to people panning for gold with wooden pans. They are not using mercury, or they weren't in the Chocó when I was doing field work. I don't know now, but the Afro-Colombian families, using hand tools and techniques, were capital non-intensive. It was hard work, lots of stones, lots of sluices. The techniques were more or less changed than they had been in the colonial period, but they weren't using mercury. There's a plant that people do use in the Chocó to catch the gold. The small scale miners, right? The people I'm going to show you pictures of in a moment, the excavators, they are using mercury, right? So these are outsiders mostly, not always. Some of them are Brazilian. They use tons of mercury. There are people who are reporting that this kind of small-scale excavators has meant that the Chocó, the Lower Cauca in other region of Colombia, has some of the highest levels of mercury contamination in the world. It is devastating, that small-scale mining. So the multinationals will make that argument, right? They'll say, this mining is illegal. It's destroying the environment. Both are true. The small-scale miners will say, we're only illegal because you made us illegal. We didn't used to be illegal. This was prior to 2001. They were not illegal. And then at that point, in part with advising of the Canadian International Development Agency, the mining code in Colombia was rewritten. It's a whole other story. And then they became illegal. There is no path to formalization because to become formal, they have to have the same environmental impact assessments as the multinationals, and you can imagine how expensive that is. So there are technical solutions. There's an NGO out of UBC that was trying to do a project in the north of the Chocó. It didn't go anywhere because of the conflict. It got worse. But they were trying to bring in different techniques, right? So there are different ways of doing small-scale mining using machines that don't use mercury. The small-scale miners will say, yeah, we use mercury. The multinational, you use cyanide. Mercury kills you over decades. Cyanide kills you right away. I think they're both don't really have a leg to stand on. There are some really interesting legal precedents that have come out of Colombia in part because of small-scale mining. So the 2016 decision by the Constitutional Court of Colombia granted the Atrato River, the main river in the Chocó, legal rights as a person, right? The river is now legally a person, just the same way a corporation is a person. And the decision was in large part a response to the government's failure to prevent the small-scale mine boom. But it gets more complicated, right? So when you start to do the numbers, you realize, those 60 mining companies from Canada that were coming to build large-scale mines, none of them got built. There might be one in Butrica in Antioquia, but the projects most of them have disappeared. The price of gold collapsed. It's now back up again, but Colombia didn't turn out to be the new El Dorado for Canadian mining companies. The Canadian mining companies that are there, that are large producers, one of them is Gran Colombia, which is a Canadian company that bought out the largest Colombian producer. That used to be that Canadian company in the 50s that I talked about. And Gran Colombia is registered in Toronto, but most of the insiders are actually Colombian. And what they're doing is buying gold from small-scale miners, right? So that they took over a Colombian mine, and now they're, maybe not all of their gold, but one of their corporate social responsibility projects is to buy gold from people using excavators. So the actual gold they're producing is coming from the kind of mining that they're doing. It's very confusing. So it's a good PR strategy. Let's demonize the illegal miners. The government is blowing them up, like coming in with the military and bombs and blowing up excavators and machines. This wasn't happening when I was in the field. It's happened afterwards. The particular area where I was working, gold miners left about 7 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. When I went back in 2017, they'd gone and been gone for a few years. But yeah, it is devastating to the environment. But if you were to put a large-scale multinational open-pit mine in the headwaters of the Andes, headwaters of the rivers in the Chocó and the Andes, which is the wettest part of the planet, right, the highest rainfall, you'd have devastating consequences as well. Yeah. Thank you, Tracy.
Well, thank you. I think I have like 6 more questions, but I'll save them for maybe we could go back to you now with the slides, and then.
Sure, I'll give a quick reading, give you a sense of the book. I'm cognizant of the time, and then maybe we can have questions at the end, or anyone who wants to hang out for further questions. So Tracy, I don't know how to do the PowerPoint. I'll let you do the PowerPoint, and I'm going to do my reading. I'm reading from the introduction. I thought of reading other places, but I need to stop you showing my entire screen. So there we are. So cresting a rise. Antonio and I stopped and surveyed the mine. 2 distant excavator machines were dwarfed by what they had dug up. With the jungle and topsoil gone, a moonscape of gravel was left. The machine trapped gold with mercury, and their tailings gushed into a sluice and down to a stream and through the forest to paint the river the color of coffee with milk. It's beautiful, I swear I heard Antonio say. So can you change the photograph? And you can change it again. My warmest memory of Antonio is from months earlier as he looked down from his perch above his father Pedro's mine. Antonio had his rubber boots kicked forward and his index fingers pointed both directions. He was all smiles. We were joking on a break from digging at the family mine. We used wooden pans in a network of channels cut into the hillside. Over months, we worked so slowly that the vegetation seemed to advance over our leftover gravel faster than we made it. When I looked out beyond the rise at those two excavators, I saw the trees wrenched and the landscape flattened. I thought of Antonio and Pedro's mine compared to the mines of his neighbors, which had been swamped by the two excavators owned by the strangers. I saw something ghastly over that rise. Antonio did not. So you can change the photo again. Antonio saw an efficiency over his hand tools. He felt satisfaction in what had taken the machines a matter of months, which would have taken him and his father a lifetime. I imagined the jungle gone and the river polluted. We had different ways of thinking about, understanding, feeling, and experiencing the same excavator operation. His vision was not what one would assume reading newspapers, magazines, non-governmental organization reports, or some of the scholarly literature. In these accounts, the impression given was that the small-scale miners of the northwest Colombian department of the Chocó, the men with those excavators, were frontier gangsters clearing the land in a quest for wealth. Spend enough time and such accounts are unsatisfying. Antonio's vision was at odds with what I saw, expressing a different way of thinking. His was the ontology of a miner. The book considers the ways Antonio and others experienced the boom times of a gold rush and the ways that this gold rush was embedded in wider legal and extra-legal economies. It would be easy to fall into a narrative found in much writing about the commodification of nature and natural resource extraction, but I strive for a different complexity by weaving together stories about the lives of artisanal and small-scale miners and those who live in the communities where those miners work. Gold enables some forms of autonomous livelihood, even as it disables others. Mines create freedom and unfreedom. They are at once destructive and constructive. The conditions of extraction and the environments affected in the miners themselves matter at least as much as the mere presence of mining. This book offers insights on the contradictory ways that gold both liberates and subjugates as mines become sites of exploitation and emancipation. What results is a twofold investigation. First, stories of lived experience drawing on the lives of a handful of miners on artisanal and small-scale gold mines. Second, stories of money laundering through gold by cocaine traffickers and speculation on mining projects by multinational corporations, wherein gold facilitates other economic processes. These accounts, nevertheless, remain stories from the margins because their setting is the poorest and most discriminated department in Colombia, and because the stories focus on those who make a living through precarious and informal shifting livelihood strategies which themselves offer a certain freedom, especially when compared to the non-existent alternatives. So I could go on for 200 pages, but I'll stop there. Really interested if anyone has any questions. We have a few more minutes left.
This video was published by the ndmediacoop.org in New Brunswick, Canada.